It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Scott Christensen, and we're going to be discussing his new book, What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. Scott, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, Scott, I know you are going to be brand new to a bunch of my viewers, a bunch of my listeners. So let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Scott Christensen origin story. Feel free to insert your superpowers, your special abilities, whatever we need to know about you. Share that with us now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in Colorado in the Denver area and moved to New Jersey when I was still a teenager and finished my high school years there. I went to Penn State University where I studied architecture and graduated with a degree in architecture and worked as an architect in Aspen, Colorado, and moved back to Colorado and worked there for about almost 9, 10 years and had a great career there. Met my wife in the Dallas area, and we got married in '93. And then in '97, the Lord called me into ministry. I left my architecture career and moved to California. Went to seminary for 4.5 years. Graduated from there and got into the ministry. I pastored a small church in Southwest Colorado near Durango for about 16 years. And for the last little over a year now, I've been an associate pastor at Kerrville Bible Church in Kerrville, Texas, and enjoying the hill country here.
Well, Scott, thanks for helping us to get to know you a little bit better. Let's transition now into what we might call the story behind the book. You must be a glutton for punishment because your previous book, you tried to answer the question, what about free will? For this new book, you're trying to answer the question, what about evil? So, what made you decide that after you tackled free will, evil was the next place for you to go?
Yeah, well, the I had come to a belief in the meticulous sovereignty of God in all things, including His sovereignty in our salvation. When I was a young man in college, and when I became convinced that that's what the Bible taught, it still left a lot of questions in my mind. Namely, well, what about our free will? If God chooses us for salvation, if He is sovereign in these things, does that make me some kind of a robot and Him some kind of a puppet master? And so those I wrestled with those questions for many years. And so as I began to think through all that, I reading scripture, reading books, listening to different perspectives on it, I began collecting a lot of that information just basically on a file on my computer. And over the years, it kind of grew and I kind of developed it and kind of organized it a little better way. And then a number of years ago, I was preaching through the book of Ephesians, and in chapter 1 of Ephesians, Paul hits the whole doctrine of divine election head on. And so, in this series of sermons that I preached on that topic, people in my congregation were asking, "Well, what about free will? What about free will?" And so I pulled some of the material that I had gathered on that and did a couple sermons on that, and they were very well received. And then probably about a year later, I decided this would make an interesting book, and so I went through the process of figuring out how to get a book published, and that's a whole story in and of itself. But eventually landed a book deal with P&R Publications Publishing, and they loved what I had written, and so I developed a really good relationship with my editor. And after the What About Free Will book was published, he said, "I think you should write a book about the problem of evil." And I said, "No, I don't think so." And but he convinced me because I had dealt briefly with that problem in the free will book. So he wanted me to expand on it. And so I spent the last 4.5 years researching and writing on the problem of evil. And quite frankly, I'm glad it's over with. It was quite a task.
And in
So
terms of
that's the story.
okay. And in terms of the particular contribution you want to make the discussion, like where do you want to go that maybe others have failed to tread, or what's kind of the secret sauce of what you want to bring to the discussion about the problem of evil?
Yeah, the most common response theologically and philosophically to the problem of evil is what is known as the free will defense. And so this is why the question of free will is often invoked when you're talking about the problem of evil. And so the most common conception of free will is known as libertarian free will. And it's the idea that we have, as human beings, we have the equal ability to choose good or evil. And there's nothing that determines what choice we would make. And so not even God can determine whether we would choose good or evil. And so ultimately, the existence of evil rests in the hands of the chooser, of the human person who's making the choice. And so the free will defense, which is the most common defense, typically tries to exonerate God from being culpable for evil by saying, in order for there to have any in order for there to be any value to our choices, we have to have this freedom of will, as is defined by libertarian freedom. And so God takes a risk that evil might occur when he grants this valuable gift of free will to human beings. And therefore, it exonerates him from evil. But free will also is what the claim is creates loving relationships between God and between others. So without free will, we don't have moral responsibility. We don't have the ability to love and experience fruitful relationships between God and ourselves and between one another. So that is the most common response to the problem of evil, and there's a lot that could be said about that. I I oppose that view in my book. I take a Calvinistic perspective, and in that perspective, there is a whole different definition of free will that is not the ability to have. We don't have the ability to equally choose one choice or another, but rather we always choose according to the strongest motives that guide our hearts and minds and thinking at the moment of choosing, and that is compatible with the notion that God also determines what our choices ultimately are, without violating our freedom. But in other words, they are compatible, and so this is known as compatibilism in the modern parlance. And uh, and so I tackle the problem of evil from that perspective, and very few people do that. Even among Calvinists, there's not a whole lot of books or works that tackle the issue full on from that perspective. So in that sense, my book is a little bit unique.
One of the things as I look at culture right now, things feel very upside down. People are saying lots of things that I would consider evil to be good and good things to be evil. If we don't have a common playing field of an agreed upon definition of God and why God matters, how can we actually even define good versus evil? Like, how do we wrestle with that? Because I feel like depending on, for lack of a better way to say, depending on which side you're on, we're not talking the same language. So to come to an agreement or an understanding of what evil is and what good is without a definition of who God is, that's a really difficult place to even start a conversation or a dialogue.
That's right, and I think in modern times, and really this goes back to the Enlightenment, and I treat this subject a little bit early on in my book. As Western culture has eliminated God from the conversation, it's become more and more difficult to deal with the problem of evil, because people can't make sense of evil. They can't make sense of why is this evil. And I think that the only way you can really define good and evil is if God exists, and particularly the God of the Bible. The triune God must exist. Many people make a big deal out of the fact that God is a God of love. But if God were a Unitarian God, in other words, one God consisting of one person, as opposed to the Trinitarian idea of one God consisting of three persons, it's very difficult to conceive of a Unitarian God as a God of love, because love implies a lover and a loved. It implies relationship. And so when we say God is love and he has been love from all eternity, well, the only reason why he could be love from all eternity is if love could be expressed between members of the Trinity. And therefore, I think the whole notion of love has to imply a Trinitarian God. And love being what we might call the supreme moral virtue, then would indicate that morality itself is very personal and not impersonal. It's not like our concept of morality is some nebulous notion out there. Well, it's wrong to love, it's wrong to hate people, and we know it's right to love people. Well, how do we get that notion unless it comes from some personal standard of a personal being? And that personal being is God, who has revealed himself as one God, yet subsisting in three persons. And so I think that can be the only basis for morality, and it can be only basis for how we can even call something evil, because this same God is himself morally perfect, which is reflected in the notion that the Bible speaks of God as love. He is love.
Well, next guy, I'd love to have you talk about a word that I know some of my listeners aren't going to know what this word means, the theodicy. So I'd like you to define that, but talk to us about the importance of developing a theodicy to help us make sense and wrestle with some of these ideas.
So the word theodicy comes from two Greek words that are transliterated into English. It comes from the word theos for God, and the word dike for judge or judgment, or justice, and or justify. It all comes from the same root word. So you combine those two words of theos and dike, and you get the word theodicy. And it's a word that simply means how God is justified in light of the problem of evil. So the term arose back in the 1700s, early 1700s, and it was a term specifically used to try to justify God's existence in the face of a world that is full of evil. So that's technically how the term is understood, or originally how the term was understood. Today, it kind of has taken on a different nuance, because in the philosophical problem of evil, you have what are known as defenses and what is known as a theodicy. So now we're getting into even more technical language. A defense is an attempt simply to exonerate God from being culpable for evil, and that's all it is intended to do. A theodicy, technically in the modern parlance, is an attempt to show why God permits or ordains evil. Defense isn't trying to ask the question, why is there evil in the world? It's just simply trying to defend God against charges that he himself is evil because there's evil in the world. A theodicy is a far more ambitious approach to the problem, because it's actually seeking to answer the question, well, we know there's evil in the world. We know that God could stop evil in the world. So the question is, why has he allowed it to happen? Does he have some purpose in allowing evil to exist in this world? So that's what a theodicy attempts to do. It attempts to answer that question.
Next, I'd love to have you help us contrast the differences between moral evil and natural evil. A lot of times, people just would say that there's just evil in the world, but talk to us about some of the maybe more nuanced ways we can understand evil.
Sure. So there's a distinction between moral evil and natural evil. So moral evil would be connected to the actions of moral agents. Okay, so who are moral agents? Well, moral agents would include God himself, because he is a moral being. It would include angels and demons. They are moral creatures. And it would obviously include human beings, who are also moral agents. It wouldn't really include the animal world, because in Christian theology, we don't consider animals moral creatures. So they are intelligent creatures that have moral agency, and particularly human beings is where the main focus is upon. So moral evil is any immoral action that a moral being would do, in violation of the moral standards that God has set forth that reflects his own character. So moral evil is a violation of the moral standards of God. That's a simple way of defining it. Natural evil, on the other hand, is calamities and destructive things or terrible things that happen in the world that aren't connected necessarily to the moral decisions of moral creatures. So we could include in those things diseases, COVID-19, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, all kinds of natural evils. You know, a rock falls off the side of a cliff and crushes a car, driving through the mountains or something like that. We would call that a natural evil. So it's not connected to any kind of moral decision making of any moral creature, but nonetheless, it causes pain and suffering. And so moral evil causes pain and suffering, and natural evil causes pain and suffering. And the biblical perspective on these things is that this is part of the curse that came upon the creation as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve. So that not only are we corrupted as moral creatures, but we also now live in a corrupt creation where natural evil occurs.
And in terms of God's goodness, how do we need to keep God's goodness, all encompassing goodness, really front and center as we're wrestling with this idea of evil?
Yes, that's very, very important. And all Christian theologians would agree on this point that one of the starting places for understanding the problem of evil and understanding God is his absolute goodness. So, regardless of your theological perspective, if you're an Arminian or if you're a Calvinist, we all agree that God is supremely good. God could never have an evil thought. God could never commit an evil action. He is wholly righteous. He is wholly good. Anything that God chooses to do must be good. So this we all agree on, and that's a kind of a base level that we can't, we just can't transgress that fundamental notion of God's goodness. Otherwise, we believe in a capricious God. We would have to believe in a God who truly is capable of evil. And wow, we would not want to live in that kind of a world.
And in terms of what we see in Scripture, can you share one or two examples of situations where God actually brought good out of evil?
Yeah, I think one of the most remarkable instances would be in the Old Testament and the story of Joseph. If you read in the last chapters of Genesis, the whole story of Joseph, where he is hated by his brothers because his father favored him and gave him the coat of many colors and all of that, and they wanted to kill him, but one of his brothers said, "No, we can't do that." And so they took him, they threw him into this pit, and then a slave caravan came around, and they just said, "Hey, let's sell him into slavery. That'd be a good idea." So they pulled him out of the pit and they sold him into slavery, and then they pretended that he had been killed and lied to his father and so forth. Well, Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he's finds himself in trouble there. He's in prison for a while for being falsely accused of sexual assault and all this sort of thing. So eventually he gets out of prison, and he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is impressed with him and elevates him to the position of essentially like a prime minister of Egypt. And he deals with a famine, and gains all this power. And during the famine, his brothers just happen to come back to Egypt, and they re-encounter their brother, and they come to realize, oh my goodness, this is our brother whom we sold into slavery, and boy, he's going to really send us off to prison or something like that. They were very fearful of him at this point. And Joseph says to them, I know that what you did was evil, but I want you to know that it is God who actually sent me here. And he summarizes that in Genesis 50:20, in which he says to his brothers, he says, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." That is a remarkable statement because it shows that there are two sides to the event of this evil that they perpetrated upon their brother. And what this verse indicates is that they intended evil with their evil actions, uh, with to what they did to Joseph. But God superintended that same event, but He had a good intention for it. And ultimately, the good that He brought out of that evil was to save Jacob's family and thereby save the messianic line through which Jesus came, and a whole host of other promises that are related to God's plan of redemption. And so it's a very critical thing. And God chose to use that event to exalt Joseph and to further the plans that God had for his people Israel.
Well, next let's talk about suffering. I think often people equate suffering with evil, but in terms of the Christian life, why can we expect suffering? Why is that? You might even say a necessary part of the Christian journey, the Christian life.
Um, well, we can expect suffering, number one, because we live under the curse. God has brought a curse upon the world as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, and that curse has yet to be removed. And so, but that suffering that we experience, especially believers and unbelievers as well, it creates a longing within our hearts. I believe every human being, because of the evil in this world, it creates a longing to be in a world that is different than the world that we live in. In other words, it creates a longing for redemption. And now many unbelievers vision that envision that redemption far differently than the way the Bible does. But from a biblical perspective, that redemption involves the sending of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to come into the world, to enter into this evil world, and to die a brutal, evil death on the cross at the hands of evil men that was, in fact, superintended by God Himself, so that through His death and resurrection, He might bring redemption, uh, not only to human beings, but ultimately bring redemption to the cursed world itself. So that as Christians, we look forward to the final redemption of this world in which we will live in a new heavens and a new earth. God will destroy the present heavens and earth by fire, just like He did back in the Old Testament through a flood. But in this new world, the curse will be completely gone. There will be no more natural evil. There will be no moral evil. And we will live in this fully redeemed state in which God's glory will pervade all of creation. And that is the longing, I believe, of every human heart, that they don't see the true story, as it were, the way the Bible lays it out. But for the Christian, suffering increases that longing and that desire for redemption. And we get a taste of that when we come to faith in Jesus Christ.
Well, it's almost time for us to wrap up, but one more question. In terms of the reader's journey with this book, they get to that last page. Like, how do you hope you've impacted them? What's that big takeaway you hope every single reader discovers in the pages of What About Evil?
I hope that people reading this book will realize that evil is not purposeless. It is not a meaningless thing that happens in our world. Yes, we may not fully understand every instance of evil or what God may have going on behind any instance of evil. We could think of that with a lot of stuff going on in our world today. It's like, what in the world is going on? Why is God, allowing this to happen? We may not really fully understand everything that God is doing. But what we can understand and what we can cling to is that we know that God is absolutely good and He is absolutely sovereign. And we can trust Him because He knows what He's doing. He is all wise, He is all good, He is all sovereign. And when we trust Him, we have an incredible level of confidence in knowing that we are secure because God promises to secure this future for His children. And it gives us great hope, even in the midst of great pain and trials and sufferings and so forth. And so we cling to God above all else because that is our only hope. He is our only resource for facing evil in this world.
And Scott, for the listeners, the viewers who would like to connect with you, find out more about your books, where can we discover you on the web?
You can find me on Facebook. You can just search up Scott Christensen on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter. I think my Twitter handle is at Pastor Scott C. And you can also find me at our church website, which is kerrvillebiblechurch.org. We're in Kerrville, Texas. And those are probably the best ways to connect with me. You can also go to my publisher's website, PRP Books, and look me up there as well.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Scott and pick up your very own copy of his new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Scott Christensen. Once again, our book today was What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. For more on Scott and his books, a couple places you can go. Head over to prpbooks.com to check out the books. And for more on Scott and his church, head over to kerrvillebiblechurch.org. And Scott, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.